All right. So today we have Sabina Cvecek, who is a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Global Fellow at the Field Museum in Chicago and the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna. Her research explores prehistoric kinship, household organization, and social practices of relatedness beyond genetics, integrating archaeological, bioanthropological, and ethnographic perspectives. She holds a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from the University of Vienna. Previously, she was a visiting researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, in Germany, and an IFK Junior Fellow at the International Research Center for Cultural Studies in Vienna. She's an elected fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute and a co-chair of the Archaeology and Gender in Europe network of the European Association of Archaeologists. Her recent publications include Why Kinship Still Needs Anthropologists in the 21st Century and Enthroned, Dethroned, Rethroned, ? Multiple Lives of Matrilineal Kinship in Aegean Prehistory. Her book, Kurichi Hoyuk 4, Household Economics in the Early Bronze Age Aegean, was published in 2022 by the Austrian Academy of Sciences Press. And today, for this talk, she is going to be talking about kin making in the past, reconsidering spatial proximity and genetic distance in Neolithic Southwestern Asia. Please help me in welcoming Sabina Cvecek.
Thank you very much, Kim, for this generous introduction. Thank you, Mac, for bringing me here today. And thank you all for showing up for this lecture today. It is really my honor to be standing here and being able to share some of my past experiences and research in archaeology, as well as my current project that Kim has mentioned I'm currently carrying out at the Field Museum in Chicago. But before we start examining this spatial proximity and genetic distance in Neolithic Southwestern Asia, I just want to say that this is my second time or third time actually in the Bay Area. And the first time was when I was it was in 2007. And we came here with a female-only choir, welcomed by the Piedmont choir singers, and we stayed with them in host families. And I think that this was really one of the crucial experiences that I decided to study cultural anthropology, because that was an amazing opportunity to do kind of participant observation without knowing it. But for the first time, we celebrated Halloween. It was the time of Halloween and did trick and treat. So it was really something that in times of globalization and in times of when iPod just conquered the world, that was something that really stuck with me. In times of globalization, we live in such a diverse and rich world in which cultural diversity persists. And we should be able to see it. And I didn't know that I'll be dwelling into the past later in my career, but that was definitely my step into cultural anthropology. So in today's talk, I'll shape it in 3 parts, and we'll start with a little bit of maybe the rather boring part that you might say, but really kinship in social cultural anthropology, with a quick overview of all the developments of about 150 years of research, to which I'm sure I cannot do justice, but just a few glimpses into development in this field. Then we'll continue with thinking about households, kinship, and gender in archaeology, which I can assure you I'm no authority, with people sitting here in the first row who can definitely tell us much more, and to which I'm indebted to kind of dwell on their theories that they have developed and interpretations. And then the final part, I will take example from Çatalhöyük, which probably most of you are quite familiar with. And again, I cannot contribute as much to it because I didn't dig there, but Ruth did. But just taking Çatalhöyük as one of the examples, and sorry, as to how to think about kinship after the ancient DNA and all the excavations that have been done at the site. And throughout my talk, you will hear that what really kind of runs as underneath my perspectives is kind of incorporating cross-cultural perspectives into Eurasian prehistory. Because as a trained cultural anthropologist, I entered into archaeology during my grad school, but really did undergrad in cultural anthropology. And because of that, I didn't get a virus of cultural history perspectives, maybe. in European archaeology, which can be a dominant paradigm. But I try to really bring anthropology closer to the archaeological context. So now let's start thinking about kinship. And to do that, I would like to quote Robin Fox, who put on this quote, and I quote, "Kinship is to anthropology what logic is to philosophy or nude is to art. It is the basic discipline of the subject." And maybe this was true in 1976, but ever since, kinship really has not remained the core subject of the discipline, as the cultural anthropology has moved on to talking about race and ethnicity and identity and many other subjects or precarity that really need to be addressed. But nevertheless, it does justice of kind of how can we think about kinship today, as there has been so much rich research in this discipline. And that goes, what Fox was referring to here is really since 1871's publication of Louis Henry Morgan's systematic collection of kin terms, where he went to different communities and started collecting kin terms such as mother, father, daughter, and so on, he realized that not everybody calls the same person a daughter or a son. And for example, on the left side, which you cannot see very well, he puts together the Eskimo or the English-speaking kinship terms. But on the right side are the Seneca, and the father would call his niece and nephew my son and my daughter, because of the patrilineal logic where brothers, sons and daughters are still your kin, and you call them really close kin as daughters and sons. So this was really revealing. And for decades later, a lot of British anthropology grappled with the issue of descent. And by today, there could be 6 main models of descent systems that are existing in the world based on cross-cultural comparison, ethnographic insights. But at the same time, if you think this as kinship trees, and which are now today very often also used in archaeogenetic research, descent really is a social principle. And that's something that I want to just highlight from Robert Parkin, who says, so what really is descent when we think about descent? And this is when ties of filiation are repeated generation after generation. And if the social emphasis is on the whole series of such links back into preceding generations and prospectively forwards into future ones, then one talks of descent. And this is very much a cultural anthropological definition of descent, in which really highlights that descent is not a biological principle, but that people can be integrated into the descent room with many other different means of co-residence, adoption, milk motherhood, and other ways that wouldn't be necessarily reflected in genetic data or genetically if we study it as such. And if cultural anthropology then became, much of theory has been on descent, there was a wave of French structuralism, namely by Claude Lévi-Strauss, who said it's not the descent which binds people into one community, but it's really marriage alliances that people are building by exchanging, well, he said women, but we know that like also men could be those binding factors between groups. And it was that kind of revelation of thinking of kinship as descent system in a one sense genealogical, but on the other hand as an alliance building. And then with Claude Lévi-Strauss later on in the 80s was really a proponent of what we would call house societies, in which he proposed that it was houses, not necessarily just the physical structures, but those houses as we would know from kind of royal families or something that holds certain societies or communities together. And I highlighted here the book from David Schneider, who put forward critique of study of kinship already in 1984. And at the time, professor at the University of Chicago, he really argued we should abandon kinship studies in cultural anthropology. And why? Because all of the kinship studies kind of preconceive this Western notion of biology and how basically we organize ourselves through biology. And Schneider has not succeeded in his way, because afterwards, the kinship studies have been transformed within cultural anthropology, especially in British anthropology with Janet Karsten talking about after kinship in her book, After Kinship. She argues for relatedness as such a concept in which we can really see people coming together into groups through sharing the food or co-residence and other means, not just blood, but maybe bones or other ways or substances that can bring people together. And for example, Marshall Salins, who in 2013 book argued for kinship is a mutuality of being. So even when somebody is born on the same day, in some societies, that is extremely meaningful. And that is like the main thing of creating kin, or like being born is the same month. And if mutuality of being sounds rather cozy, the recent edited volume by Catherine Goldfarb and Sandra Bamford on difficult attachments really highlighted, they pulled together people to think about when is kinship not cozy, and what happens when kin ties are broken, and when biology is reshuffled, or when we break away from kin ties that we would normally be inhabited. And I can just like look into the room and ask just a question. Who of you is currently living with the family into which you were born into? Okay, not many. And who of you will be maybe after that return to the community where you were born into? Maybe a few more, but yeah. So this is really kind of also thinking about the kin is being made through life, but also death, and how we organize ourselves can really differ. Now, before I conclude with this first part, rather dry, quick turnaround of kinship studies in cultural anthropology, I just want to leave with this quote from Dwight Reed of what is kinship. And he says that kinship has to do with cultural systems that include biological facts and not biological systems that include cultural facts. And I think that this is important. So it's kind of not saying that kinship is not biology, but that kinship, as we know it, can include biology, but it doesn't have to be biology. Now, as a follow-up to this introduction, I would like to, as next, look into quickly the development of household, kinship, and gender in archaeology to kind of set us the stage for where my current project sits at. And as you may well know about, and the household archaeology actually emerged through collaboration between cultural anthropologists and archaeologists. And this was the paper which then coined the term household archaeology from Richard Wilk and William Rutke. And they really defined household as one of the basic social units, or the smallest economic unit that can be studied archaeologically, and try to think about how people pull labor or redistribute labor and so on, and to move away kind of from kinship ties, or thinking through kinship in archaeology. But I will come to that slightly later. Ever since, I would like to highlight 3 books in this part. Gender and kinship really cannot be separated from one another. And that was an edited volume in 1987, published by Collier and Yanagisako, where they gathered a lot of scholars in Bellagio, Italy, and discussed how gender and kinship manifest into each other and how they should be always studied together. And as, of course, everyone knows, it was really this edited volume that stepped forward all this kind of discussion on gender in prehistory, and not just see past as genderless, but put gender into the past, and not see households as faceless blobs, but actually put faces into the activities and symbolic value of women that they carried in the past. So yeah, Joan Garrow and Mac Conkey were really crucial in pushing the discipline forward into thinking about it. And the third book that I would like to highlight is kind of, if I have mentioned earlier the thinking about how society is a social organization in the past, really Rosemary Joyce and Susan Gillespie, like they put together people to look into the past through the houses, and to think about social organization within houses in the past and how important they were for community building. And that was based on Levi-Strauss's The Way of the Math book, where he first time proposed the house society model for social organization. This being said, all of that kind of literature that I outlined was some of the literature that I dealt with or I read during my PhD project, in which I was embedded as a cultural anthropologist in a team with two other archaeologists and one zoo archaeologist between 2016 and 2021 at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And our goal was to actually look at the role of households in the early Bronze Age in the Aegean between 2700 and 3000 BC. And my role was really kind of bringing the cultural anthropological perspectives into this project. And we looked at two sites. One of them is Platia Magula Zako in northern Greece, close to modern city of Larissa. And the other one, Cvecek, which is in western Turkey, western Anatolia. And this is the prehistoric site next to the ancient city of Ephesus. So I know everybody can pronounce Ephesus, less people can pronounce Cvecek. But that is really the link. The aim was to kind of look at like what happened around Ephesus area in prehistory and not just in ancient times. And during this time, I was given a fantastic opportunity to join my colleagues in the field. And this is from Seljuk excavation house in Western Anatolia. So I could really feel I was not part of the excavations, as though those were already older excavations, but I could see really the lengthy process of documenting archaeological sites and how do we build models from this genderless material that one sees on the tables, right? And at the same time, on the picture right, you can see I was fortunate to record 3,000 shells by length, width, height, and weight to help my colleague in zooarchaeology. But nevertheless, that was kind of a first insight of, everybody talks about excavation, but it's really documentation of those finds and putting them into databases that are so crucial in archaeology and how then we think about the past. And I will not talk about my project, but I just want to highlight one of those things that is kind of one of the main conclusions, and I kind of argued in my book, for diverse and coexisting models of social organization in early Bronze Age Western Anatolia. And the material at Cvecek really didn't seem look exactly like at Troy in the earliest layers of Troy, where Maria Ivanova inferred egalitarian society. But it also didn't look like the one at Polyochny, where there was a chiefdom inferred by Orania Kuka, and who argued that based on one metalworking workshop in which a lot of foreign material or long distance material has been accumulated, that's kind of the seat of chief. And at Cvecek, we had the metalworking rather spread across the settlement in different houses, and then that was really looking differently from either the Polyochny or Troy, where there was no metal production documented at all. And I kind of argued for heterarchical society in which households shared but also competed with each other for metalworking, but also other means. And in cultural anthropology, that could be called a great man society, or it's known as a great man society, but that doesn't mean that great women don't exist in these societies. And just one publication that I would like to highlight from my PhD was thinking about who was producer of those metals. So because ever since Gordel Child, it was always kind of postulated with the Bronze Age, we have those itinerant male smiths who then move from the Near East into the Balkans and spread then the metalworking. But that didn't seem to be the case at Cvecek if we have this scattered metalworking evidence. And it seemed like that both men, women, and children could be part of it because they were located in houses next to textile working or food production and food consumption. And that kind of led me to write this paper and look into ethnography if we have other communities where women and children also participate in metalworking. And that's the case. And for example, just for children's task, if you doubt it, they would go to the rivers and sample the ore and then help dry it on the sun before the ore can be even processed or so. So there is really multi-layered production of metals that could be maybe possible in prehistory as well. And from the book that Kim already mentioned, so I published my research from PhD in the book Cvecek 4, Household Economics in the Early Bronze Age Aegean. And I quote here from that book saying, which I think is one of my insights that kind of led me to the next project. Although household archaeology was initially established to move away from discourses on kinship, in my understanding, we cannot describe a house and its household activities as a purely materialistic and economic character, but should also recognize a house as a locus and minimal social arena of kinship. And I think that has been done before. This is really nothing new, but I think it was this shift of thinking about households as economic factors rather than what happens on social basis as well. And because that was really preceding the archaeogenetic results, which today you can think about matrilineality or patrilineality, based on household archaeology and earlier theories, there was this precondition that we should be seeing matrilineal communities during the Neolithic in Europe, and then seeing patrilineal communities in the Bronze Age. And that was put forward by Andrew Sharad based on changes in farming, saying, as he proposed, that during the Neolithic, the communities practiced horticulture and were therefore matrilineal, versus the introduction of the plow led to patrilineal descent. And another scholar who was famous or infamous for her grand theories was Maria Gimbutas, who also argued that the old Europe was matrilineal and sex egalitarian, and a mixed agricultural pastoral economy and patriarchal society then emerged during the Bronze Age. And these were really theories based also on many different things, like Maria Gimbutas argued also a lot from figurines. And this is not, I'm not gonna talk about that, but I want to pass this around. It's a house model from Platia Magula Zarco, 3D printed, that was also used for a lot of things, how to argue for matrilineal kinship based on figurines and the size of those figurines. So you can just enjoy that while I talk. And one of the studies that has been really a laboratory for a lot of different interpretations of what kinship is and how people were organized in the past was also Çatalhöyük. And that's the site that I'll be talking soon. But what I want to highlight is like the initial excavator of the site, James Mallard, argued from early on, based on the numerous female figurines, or as he would describe them, the gender, that this community was matrilocal and matrilineal community. And ever since, there has been a lot of work done to show differently. But nevertheless, so this was kind of like my background while I was doing PhD, to think about and how I tapped into kinship, thinking about kinship in the past. But during finishing my PhD, there were all these studies that came out during that time, asking whether Europe's megalithic societies were patrilineal, thinking about matrilineal continuity in non-isolated region of Tuscany, about kinship-based social inequality in the Bronze Age. And this is really to highlight one of the most recent ones. For example, the pervasive matrilicality during the Iron Age Britain. So in that regard, we don't see just matrilineality in Neolithic, but now we could see it also in Iron in Britain. And those cases, so without the last one, it was really interesting for me to kind of look into archaeogenetic papers and see that there is almost no anthropological literature that is kind of being brought into it, even though cultural anthropology really played a key role in thinking about kinship in the past. And that was one of my drivers for asking the questions that I want to ask in my current research project that I am currently carrying out. And before I developed it, I knew that on the one hand, I might not have a lot of friends among the ancient DNA researchers if I try to ask, what about when kinship does not equal genetic proximity? But I also knew that there is vast amount of literature within the archaeology, which has already been doing that for decades prior to the ancient DNA. Thinking about here, Rosemary Joyce, about Bradley Anser, Joe Brook, in many cases where people try to dig into, look and tap into those contexts where biological proximity does not mean kinship, or where kinship is constructed by other means, by just biological kin. So in my current project, I'm looking at two questions. And these are the first one: how can the material structures, such as settlements, buildings, artifacts, and biological markers, be read as material codes of prehistoric kinship? And meaning, I call them a code because maybe we will never know with 100% assurance that this was the kinship. And second, how can ethnographic reports exemplify rather than verify variability of kinship during prehistory? And here, exemplification goes for how can we take the context that have already been researched and published to shed a different light onto those contexts when we bring the ethnography in and cross-cultural data. And the research sites that I looked into, or I'm looking into, are all based in Southeastern Europe and Anatolia, namely during the Neolithic and Bronze Age, namely Vucedol, Lepenskivir, as well as Çatalhöyük and Arslantepe. And why I have selected those sites is simply for a basic reason that all of those sites have residential burial. Because I wasn't, as I told you, I came from kind of household archaeology background and cultural anthropology background. I was not necessarily very eager to look into cemeteries as a very different mode of archaeological evidence, but to still have a house as a unit based on which one can think as a next layer of community organization or so. And in my project, I use mixed methods approach, namely kinship-related approaches in archaeology, such as published ancient DNA results, stable isotopes, settlement patterns, and household archaeology, as well as qualitative controlled comparison, or what Wiley would call also the simple analogy between archaeological and ethnographic examples. And finally, once I'll be able to look at each site individually, I'll be conducting a regional comparison, both synchronic and diachronic, to think about how kinship changed over time from Neolithic to Bronze Age. And as Kim has already mentioned, I published some of those questions and why we need to be integrated into the community with archaeologists and archaeologists, ancient DNA researchers, and cultural anthropologists to push kind of those ways of thinking forward in anthropology today. And now I'm coming to our third part, and the part that I'm excited about to talk to you about. It's kinship at Çatalhöyük. And as you know, sometimes one writes a project and things don't go always as planned. But in my case, I was kind of fortunate because even though Çatal has been, so my thinking about why Çatal was because a lot has been researched, a lot has been published. And even though people would say the site is still messy and we don't agree, and that's fine, I knew that I could be able to dive into the literature and be able to follow the traces and talk to the excavator and be able to be in touch with the community. But at the same time, I was fortunate to participate on a 2-day workshop in Ankara in spring last year, which was led by Mehmet Somel, an ancient DNA researcher at the Middle Eastern Technical University in Ankara, who had all the samples from Çatal, about 450. And then that was the final workshop before the publication of the paper that appeared later in Science. And in that workshop was also present Ian Hodder as the excavator and his current PhD student, Defne, as well as the group of archaeogeneticists with whom Mehmet Somel has worked with. And that was really invaluable because, first of all, I could think about how geneticists are thinking about kinship and how they analyze it. And at the same time, I could experience how such papers come into being. I am not gonna do ethnography of ancient DNA, but I could at least have this insight of how does one come to final results. Now, paper has been published, recently appeared in Science, titled Female Lineages and Changing Kinship Patterns in Neolithic, Çatalhöyük. And what, of course, stands out here is really female lineages, which was maybe unexpected, but that's what kind of ancient DNA results have shown, that at this site, it is when people are related to each other, this goes through the female line. Now for a brief introduction to the site, this is a multi-period site in central Turkey in Konya Plains, and it has been excavated in the 1960s by James Mallard. And then for 25 years, there was a project led by Ian Hodder from Stanford University, and Ruth Tringham has been working there as well with her Berkeley team. So this is really a beautiful place to be able to speak to you about that. Even though I was not part of the excavations, but it was really an admiring project where a lot of specialists from different fields gathered at the site, tried out new methods to push kind of archaeological sciences, but also visualization and other means that or documenting or the site. As you may know, the Çatalhöyük, that was the Neolithic site where people were living in those agglutinated houses next to each other, and the various occupation at some times what used to be up to 10,000 people at the same time as kind of being a proto-urban settlement during the Neolithic. Recent study by Arek Marciniak and Ian Kite kind of pushed those numbers really lower to about a couple of hundred people being at the site at the same time, when we take into the account that not all the houses were basically inhabited at the same time. And unlike as people in Central Europe, for example, bury most of their dead away from residences, people at Çatalhöyük buried some of their dead underneath house floors. And as I said, that was also one of the motivations for looking at this site. The site has come through many interpretations, or there have been many interpretations for the site that were put forward. I just want to mention two, namely the history houses, as Ian Hodder argued for. There are certain houses at the settlement where more than 60 people are buried underneath the house. And these buildings are also beautifully elaborated. And there is a lot of labor that went into it. And those would be kind of like the glue to hold the community together. Or the house society, as we have seen the trajectory from cultural anthropology into archaeology, and was put recently forward by Ian Kite. At the same time, as you remember, I said James Mallard and then Maria Gimbutas really argued for Çatalhöyük as being one of those matrilineal sites, but also like kind of promoting mother goddesses, which were then debunked by also people sitting in the room. Other teams try to look at like what are the evidence for maleness at this site, and that is just a paper here kind of promoting phallocentrism and also looking at there is this male perspectives in the settlement, as well as what Sabina Agarwal did was like kind of showing that through bone degradation, it seems that in old age, the men and women seem to have either same diet or they have the same kind of lifestyle. So it seems kind of like an egalitarian site when it comes to old age. And genetically, if you can think about another Neolithic site to compare Çatalhöyük with, or the geneticists compared it, or maybe wish for, there is a site, a Neolithic site in Gergy, France, and that was a site where 7 generations of genetic pedigree were reconstructed for one cemetery. But that is a cemetery. It's not a residential burial, right? So one should be aware of that. But at the same time, the way that this site is represented, what I am definitely puzzled with are the unlinked, unrelated individuals. So even though we have at this cemetery a lot of people who are buried through the male together because they relate through the male line, there are plenty of individuals who cannot be aligned to any of the pedigrees. And now tracing up to 10 generations back, where you can see 10,024 individuals, it seems that there is still those unrelated individuals are present, but not possible to really align in a kinship tree. And the not being so much able to align into kinship tree was more like a standard at Çatalhöyük, because these are the largest pedigrees that have been reconstructed from the site. And so the longest one is here through 3 generations. And in all cases, all of them are connected through the missing females or like genetically female individuals. And that was kind of the reason for geneticists to infer the female lineages at a site, so that people there were connected through women or biologically connected through women, sometimes buried together within the same houses, but in most cases just being women that would be missing, but individuals would be related with each other, even though the woman was missing. And for just taking as a short case study that I would like to talk about here is like room 54 at Çatalhöyük, which bared really interesting evidence, and that is 6 individuals were actually buried. First of all, it wasn't a history house. So there is not 60 individuals. It's one of those non-super elaborated and kind of short-lived houses at the site. And 6 infants were buried next to the house wall. I looked into the documentation material, kind of contemporary to each other. And not all 6 of them could be sampled, but there were 2 with XX and 2 with XY chromosomes. And in the main room, there were 3 adults that were interred as well. And those 4 infants were found in a primary context and interred during the occupation. So that's the location very close to the wall there. And what is intriguing, so what I haven't mentioned is that all these 4 infants turn out to not be genetically related. And that was a really puzzling evidence of where archaeologists and geneticists then kind of push for, we need to try to acquire more. What is the reason of burying these infants together within this settlement, within this next to those house walls? And one of the intriguing things that came out was based on the nitrogen analysis in room 54, it was that some of those, the 4 individuals rather clustered together in terms of nitrogen. And at the same time, they really differ from first generation, those individuals that are related with first generation and others. So there was 2 main interpretations that they have put forward. And one is that the same mother likely breastfed infants from room 54, or that breastfeeding mothers had the same diet throughout their lives. And when I was sitting in this workshop at a time with colleagues in Ankara, I really thought this is great, in a sense of this is how social science or like natural sciences or scientific methods can let us think about kinship, that not only in terms of genetic, but also when not being genetically related is meaningful. So not just putting people on those genetic trees and reconstructing them, but actually taking people who are not genetically related very seriously and thinking about what other ways are there to intentionally bury these children together. And for a cultural anthropologist, I couldn't but to think about that as of the importance of suckling and even of milk kinship. And even though this is kind of an obscured way, and we can think about ancient DNA are those visible or invisible traits of making kin, this is something that kind of cultural anthropology can contribute to the picture. And what I have looked at was that in Ihrab world cultures, it seems that like before was always thought that there is milk kinship that is usually practiced in Islamic communities, but it seems this really goes beyond Islamic communities as well. And even today, milk kinship exists in Turkey. So I would not want to draw any direct analogy between prehistory and today. And it's also the case in Southeastern Europe, like Cveček po mleko, or in Turkish, the süt kaşedler. But really, it's a practice that exists in many communities around the world. And I follow here the definition of Fatwa Al-Gwindi, namely who quotes, she defines milk kinship as breastfeeding in which infants are nursed by lactating women who are not their birth mothers or genetrix, and social and or kinship links are thereby created. So this is kind of an evidence that yeah, there could be other ways of making kin in the past beyond just sharing the genes, but it could be milk among one of them. And I wouldn't say the only one, because there are many other ways that one could think about kinship at Çatalhöyük. As I haven't brought together all the other case studies that we could talk about, but it's really one, milk kinship could be one of those ways, as well as the adoption, commensality, mutual help, co-residence, and even age grades. If you think about those infants were buried together next to the wall, at Çatalhöyük, it's known that even though everybody, both adults and children, are buried underneath house floors, they are usually buried in different parts of the house. Children or infants being buried in rather dirtier parts of the houses, and the adults in the cleaner platforms. And I think that that could be one way of thinking as age grades, where people in the same cohort kind of move through different life stages, would be one of the ways to think about kinship in the past. And if I open up this discussion of putting on the timeline where what kind of interpretations of kinship and household were there at Çatalhöyük, we can say that James Mallard argued for matrilocal and matrilineal communities. With later, there was an idea of history houses. After that, we have house society. And with the new genetic data that have been recently just put forward and examined and studied, we turn to female lineages. And I have highlighted it to kind of think about this cycle of theory that goes from one idea that was initially put forward, then disentangled, and then in a way reinstated in a new form with very new state-of-the-art data, but nevertheless maybe just put forward as one idea, as one main interpretation. And I think that this is kind of a thing that, like, just thinking about patrilineality or matrilineality in the past is not enough. And I hope to maybe show that in really last 5 minutes of my talk, where just thinking about why labels such as matrilineal or patrilineal can be really problematic is I will compare quickly the one case from Hopi in American Southwest and Trobrianders in Pacific, which both have matrilineal descent. But whereas Hopi follow the matrilocal residence, the Trobrianders follow the avuluncal residence. And after marriage, they follow the bride's brother. They move into his household or his village. Whereas women own houses and storage among the Hopi, it is men or mother's brothers who own the houses and storage. It is women who make very important decisions within houses among the Hopi, but it is men who make those among the Trobrianders. Whereas the Hopi follow kind of a the highest political office would be the Council of Elders, in which both male and female or elders of all genders are able to participate in this council. The highest political office among the Trobrianders is the chief, and usually that is a male chief, even though that is a matrilineal society. And decisions in public domains are made by Council of Elders among the Hopi versus those are made by the chief. Like, are we going to warfare? Are we going to exchange or trade and things like that? Are we going to expeditions? So in both cases, they can be decentralized communities and centralized social-political constellations that exist within these matrilineal communities. And that's why I feel the term can be problematic when we just dilute it to one label. So that was something that I have previously published on why there was this enthroning, dethroning, and maybe potential rethroning of matrilineal kinship in the Aegean prehistory. And I really try to argue that those matrilineal communities do not necessarily share the same residence pattern. The women do not necessarily own storage houses or land in these communities. They're not necessarily heads of households, and that women do not necessarily hold the highest political role, and that those systems can be both centralized or decentralized. So, and these are really kind of the questions that we should be looking closer when thinking about that. And even though I'm sure some of them, archaeologists would argue, they are invisible, but at least I feel like we should be able to detangle them and think about those interpretations critically. So now if we look back and just ask ourselves, from my title, why reconsidering spatial proximity and genetic distance from anthropological perspective matters, I would say it's really the aim to probe the archaeogenetic equation, which means genetic proximity is kinship, and that's how we can easily map it and visualize it and present it. It is to highlight the diversity of ways of becoming kin in the past, as there is not only one way, namely through biology, of becoming kin, but many other ways. To highlight complexities and social roles in communities with a matrilineal, patrilineal, or bilateral descent, and to develop, hopefully one day, a shared language between social culture anthropology, archaeology, and archaeogenetics on kinship. And this is something, so maybe I have one more minute or two. So these are kind of my concluding remarks for today. But I would like to say that I try to create some of those shared languages or bring people together to think communally about it. This is my, ever since coming to Chicago, I've collaborated with colleagues in Serbia and Turkey on comparison between Lebenskive and Vargin Höyük. I visited them in person, but really our main collaborator was Zoom, which enabled us being connected over such distances. And ever since coming to Chicago, I held a session between archaeologists, cultural anthropologists, and geneticists presenting in the same session at the AAA in 2023 in Toronto and at the AIA in 2024 in Chicago, and put together with Mansur Agaman from the University of Chicago, a geneticist, and Penny Bickle, an archaeologist from the University of York, we putting together a special issue on kinship trouble, traversing interdisciplinary boundaries between archaeology, archaeogenetics, and social culture anthropology, which will hopefully come out by the end of this year or hopefully in early next year in Cambridge Archaeological Journal. And we also organized a conference in Vienna last year together with my colleagues Katarina Reber-Salisbury and Ana Herrera Corral, where we assembled again a group of geneticists, archaeologists, and cultural anthropologists to think about beyond genetics, exploring aspects of non-biological kinship in prehistoric times, which paper just recently appeared. And this is an unusual paper, and I can say thank you to the peer reviewers who allowed us to do that, but it's a paper where everybody has a small voice within the paper, and then we try to draw a conclusion on how we can identify non-biological kin. And finally, what were many takeaways from Beyond Genetics workshop that I had was really people created new ties, and this answer of like having nice people in the workshop that can talk to each other despite the disciplinary boundaries or divides was a wonderful experience to see. And finally, I'll be also organizing an SAR advanced seminar in May next year, together with Peter Whiteley from AMNH on reimagining descent, apropos archaeogenetics, new interdisciplinary perspectives. Finally, as Kim has already mentioned, I hope to see some of you or all of you this evening when we will enter into dialogue with Meg Conkey and all other fabulous geneticists on how we can interpret ancient DNA data. And with this, thank you very much to I would like to say first to my mentors that are scattered between Austria and in the US, but really thank you so much for being with me today and attending this talk, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And thank you so much, Mac, again, and everyone and Sarah for making this happen, really. Thanks, and Kim.
Thank you so much for that. I'm sure there's going to be loads of questions. I'm going to let we're going to need the popsicle to go around, and please wait for this to come to you. But if there are any questions.
Does he have a microphone in it?
Yeah.
Really? clever. Sabina, this was fantastic. I knew it would be, and I love your stuff. And I think the way that you are really pointing the way forward to constructively deal with or incorporate the DNA materials and data into all of the earlier ideas and earlier materials, not just on gendered life, but also on households living in the domestic sphere or wherever, everyday life. And you know, I'll have tons of questions and I'll ask you a lot of them, I'm sure. And I don't want to take up the whole room, but I think you, with your showing that slide of, which I copied, I hope you didn't mind, of how the dealing with gender, but also the idea of kinship at Çatalhöyük has been dealt with differently from Melat until nowadays. And one of the things which changed after the whole history houses phase that you talked about was something that I think is worth pointing out, that at Çatalhöyük, the scale at which the scale of detail at which excavation was carried out, which they were able to carry out because of the way the site is formed and the material is preserved, but the way in which it was revealed by excavation was amazing, and it was so much detail, which is really showing the history of each house in its relationship to each other house or space or room, whatever you want to call them. And doing that in a chronological perspective is just extraordinary. And it's the way, and it fits so much with the detail at which genetic data should be interpreted, and which is what you're doing. You know, that's the whole idea of the effort that you're very much an important person with now. And that's what's making the difference. That made for me a revolution, and I knew it would be coming, because that was why I joined the Çatalhöyük project in the first place, and had my friend here excavating. What we were doing at that point was to link the history of the house residents with the history of the burials. Mm-hmm. And you had to do that. You couldn't just take each burial and in a kind of larger scale. You had to have the detail of it, those two aspects of life and death. I like that. I mean, I don't like that, but but anyway, thank you so much. And I'll
I mean, I can say shortly something like, thank you so much, Ruth, for this comment. And what you have made me think about now, how kinship can also change or something. What I haven't mentioned during my talk is also that over the time, over the 1,000 years that they studied at Çatalhöyük, also archaeogenetically, it seems that like at the very beginning of the site, more people are buried together when they are genetically related, and over time it kind of changes, that people start being less genetically related. Well, but throughout the time, yeah,
much more egalitarian.
Yeah, thank you.
As somebody who excavated a lot of the burials, I will tell you that during the excavations, we talked about this a lot. We would analyze this house, we would analyze that, see who was in it. And it became really clear, obviously, that it wasn't nuclear families. We had a lot of talks about who it was and how they're related, because there was an uneven pattern to it too. Some houses were just chock full of people. some less. Anyway, it's nice to see that there's some kinship thing going because we threw this around for like years. We talked about this. So it's nice to get some evidence of what might have been happening. A lot of us did feel that it was female lineages. It's not something that we didn't think about a lot. Yeah. So anyway, I appreciate it. I'm going to start looking at some of the stuff you've done.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you for sharing that, because what I think as well was like, so you said like from burials, once you connect them to the houses, you kind of understand it's not a nuclear family, right? Even the fact that children are buried away from adults, I think it's kind of, or not always, but also you have cases where, let's say, adult female would be buried with a child and they are also not genetically related, it turned out. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, but there is really, and I think that Marine Pilon, she was like doing this comparison with teeth, right? This was before the genetic dental analysis, and she would also point that many times people being buried together were not genetically related.
That was a morphological.
Dental morphology, correct. And I feel like now with genetics, it kind of reaffirms this kind of feelings that although one would want to see nuclear families within those houses, it really wasn't there.
It was never going to be that.
Yeah, Laurie has reminded me of something that I also wanted to say to you, that I think it's really important that you bring the actual sort of the idea of death and genetics into the question, into the whole equation, because there's something about, you know, how did these people die when you think of it as a kind of mystery, which brings me to the other thing, that what you're doing has to be published in a lot of detail so that then those of us can write microhistories, historical novels of using the data. But that's, so you won't forget to do that, I hope.
Well, in the same vein, you know, the 4 infants that you had together, I mean, we can think about them being related, but when we were doing it, we were thinking, how did they die? Did they die at the same time? Do we have something going on where infant mortality, something hit them and they all went? So, you know, when we think about people and death, we also have to think of people surviving and not surviving and who those are, and not forget the survivors and not forget that people die.
Yeah.
For some reason.
Correct.
Which, you know, archaeologically, you can't always tell.
I know. I mean, I didn't mention infanticide here today.
You also have to imagine the survivors, as she's saying. As Laurie's saying, that the survivors are there. Are they always, you know, where are they buried?
Yeah.
That's the sort of
And for example, this becomes tricky because then once you have those ungenetically related infants buried, you cannot locate the survivors. Or let's say you could locate them biologically, but then even by non-ancient DNA means, it's really hard to pinpoint them, like how they would relate to them, right? But the great point of thinking about survivors and who is depositing and like intentionally burying those children in the spots that they are buried in.
This is why we sit in the front row.
Any other questions? Yeah, we can check if there's any on the stand.
Okay.
It may only be visible on the other one.
Oh no. Okay.
No, I think
Do you see there?
it's on the chat. There's a
Oh,
button.
Yeah.
Sorry. I think it's on that.
Oh,
one.
okay.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Should I do something here? Stop here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Stop share, and then you should be able to
Oh,
see the
okay,
button.
that's great. Okay, it's thumbs up.
Okay.
It's thumbs yeah.
If
Yeah.
I'm just gonna say one thing. Just you may well know there's a Bronze Age group of infants that were found buried together in the same space under a house floor in northwestern Peloponnese near Patras, and the genetics have shown that there are likely at least 3 generations of babies that have that died either as mostly neonates, and they kept returning to the same place to bury them. And what was interesting is, again, maybe this is the Bronze Age being patrilineal, but at that point, most of the babies are related to each other through the male line. However, there are also a couple that are related through sisters, that were one of which seems to be the mother of other babies, so was perhaps married into this household, and then her sister sort of comes out of nowhere also with an infant that has died and is included in what seems to be another household. Or is this showing some kind of extended household line that we wouldn't know about if we didn't have that connection? So it just, it's another very interesting, I mean, I was shocked that they had as good results as they did from this material, but it shows that return to location for a certain age group, in this case perhaps because they were related through the male line, but then also there's other relations as well, and potentially there were others that were buried there that they didn't get samples from, so there may have been others that weren't related as well. So it's an interesting comparison.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
this is really kind of attachment to a place or somebody who passes this memory, right? Because it's a memory if it's 3 generations.
That's right. That's right. They're
be able-
returning generation to generation of this. And I always think about the survivors in that case, that family that was, obviously high infant mortality rate. We don't always see that in the archaeological record that we know of it, but we don't necessarily see the burials in the way that this one did. And thinking about people living in that space over all those generations, knowing that this is a constant thought, and keeping them, specifically burying them in this spot, I think for that connection to memory and over time, and that how powerful that would have been. Yeah. Huh? No. It's been partially published and there's more coming out, but they were part of a study that we did that some of our genetic work from our project was included in. So I got to learn more about it from behind the scenes, but it's an interesting, a unique find, I think. I mean, maybe there'll be more, but it was a really rare occurrence to be able to find that number of infants buried together.
Right.
So, but it really made me think of that when you were talking about this entirely different, non-genetically related group of infants and what would bring them together. Yeah.
And I mean, I can just point out like a weird case as well where Bill and I talked about, and we don't know because genetics wasn't done yet. But it's like a cave, Aleppo-Tripoli cave or so.
Yes.
And there would be also
Southern
Neolithic
Peloponnese.
people buried, and then
Correct.
in the same spots, like infants, also Bronze Age. So there is some kind of memory or continuation
over several thousand years. Yeah.
So it's not 3 generations; it could be like millennia, or that this seemingly oral history has been passed on to future generations.
Really remarkable. Yep. I'll get her.
Thanks so much. We're are delighted to have you back after meeting with you last spring, and also to look forward to the panel discussion this evening, which will focus on interpretation. But I just wanted to say that it's still the case, as we all know, that we really need to question these fundamental, so-called fundamental and inclusive attempts at concepts like patrilineal or matrilineal. And the example from a recent analysis of ancient DNA at Pompeii is just a perfect example, with the media saying, oh, look, here we have an adult and we have an infant or a small child. It's clearly a mother and her offspring, when of course it turned out to be an adult male and an unrelated child. And so, those kinds of things just point out why probing these kinds of questions is so crucial to our getting a better understanding of the past. So thanks a lot, Sabina.
Thank you. Yeah, I cannot fully agree. I can just fully agree to that. Because I think that, I mean, if like, that's why I also feel like that's why anthropology is kind of crucial, because there has been those 150 years of research done, and like people since the 80s then, or David Schneider, try to go away from biology. But then with the new techniques, we go back to biology to seek the explanations. And this biological gaze is always like somehow present for certain reasons. Thank you.
Well, help me thank again.
Thank you.